The story of the McReary crime organization begins in the year 1922, when 11-year-old Francis McReary would immigrate to Liberty City with his parents, Declan and Deirdre McReary, and his young sister Aisling McReary. The McReary family, a poor family from Dublin, Ireland, would look to evade the turmoil and hardship in their homeland of Ireland, and in turn would settle in the lower west side of Algonquin, in an apartment at the corner of Galveston Avenue and Hellgate. Since the late 1800s, this area of lower West Algonquin along Hellgate had become the home to a massive Irish population, and would be nicknamed Little Ireland. Over these years, as the Irish population had established themselves along Hellgate, Irish gangs would rise to power in the area. By the 1920s, when the McRearys had arrived in Algonquin, the area of Hellgate and Galveston was under the control of Irish gang leader Conor "the Fox" O'Brien. The Fox, who earned his nickname for both his cunning manner and his bright orange hair, led a massive gang on Hellgate involved in bootlegging, extortion, and gambling. The O'Brien gang worked in conjunction with Dukes-based gang leader, another Irishman, Bill the Bomber O'Brien, and the two would eventually form ties with legendary Dukes-based Italian mob leader Mario Messina. However, in Algonquin, the O'Brien gang had long been rivaled by other Italian gangs from nearby Suffolk, and by the 1920s, with the growth of these Italian gangs, the O'Brien gang would seriously struggle to compete for underground rackets. By 1922, the west side of Suffolk Algonquin was under the control of notorious gang leader 30-year-old Don Johnny Pavano and his newly formed Pavano Crime Syndicate, and at the time this group was quickly becoming the most prominent bootlegging operation in all of Algonquin. The Pavanos, who were extremely violent, well-organized, and large in numbers, were fiercely loyal to Johnny Pavano, who had took control of the gang after the 1921 slaying of his boss, Pete the Boss Marcello. As the Pavanos rose in the early 1920s, it became impossible for Conor the Fox and the Irish mob to compete, and the Pavanos would regularly shake down O'Brien's gang. This reduced the O'Brien gang to a highly localized gang, controlling small rackets around the Hellgate area in the lower west side. The McRearys, as they began to settle into Liberty City, would take up several jobs. Declan McReary worked by day as a blacksmith in the Fishmarket South area, and by night as a petty thief. The young Francis McReary would never spend a day in school, and would start off his time in Liberty City shining shoes on Frankfort Avenue, as well as stealing from local street vendors. Declan McReary, who had a severe drinking problem, was known to be violently abusive to both his wife Deirdre and his son Francis, and during Francis McReary's youth, he would be tormented by his father. In 1926, after 4 years of living in Liberty City, Declan McReary would be shot and killed during a botched burglary in Middle Park West. Francis McReary, who was now 15 years of age, would spare no emotion for the death of his father, and would take on the role of supporting his mother and sister. It was during this time Francis McReary would join a local gang of Irish youths known as the West Siders. The West Siders, who served as a feeder team on Hellgate for the O'Brien gang, was a tough criminal gang involved in robbery, gambling, and violence. The West Siders, which was comprised solely of young Irish members, was known to despise Italians, and would commonly beat and even kill Italians around the Hellgate area. It was around this time Italian youths in the lower West Side would begin to form street gangs to fight the West Siders. By 1927, Francis McReary had become a highly respected member of the West Siders, and was known for generating substantial cash flow for the gang, as well as carrying out several racial beatings against blacks and Italians around the neighborhood. Francis McReary, who had been abused for most of his young life, was a cold-hearted and ruthless criminal, and McReary would gain power in the fear he imposed within his community. In 1928, Francis McReary would murder a corrupt Irish police officer from the Lower West Side's Frankfort Avenue precinct named James Sullivan. Sullivan, who was known to shake down the Irish businesses along Hellgate and beat local residents, was hated in the neighborhood, and when McReary murdered him, he would earn himself the undivided respect of the neighborhood. By the year 1930, the now 19-year-old Francis McReary would gain a leadership role within the West Siders, and had gained the attention of Conor the Fox O'Brien and his gang, who saw McReary as a rising star in the streets of the Lower West Side. While Conor the Fox O'Brien and his gang had for years been shaken down and taxed by the Pavanos, McReary and the West Siders had by the early 1930s developed highly lucrative underground rackets around their neighborhood, including extortion, loan sharking, fencing, and gambling, and the West Siders would pay no tribute to any Italian mafia families. It was during this time in the early 1930s that McReary and many of his top men would become directly involved in the O'Brien gang. By this time in the early 1930s, the West Siders, as well as members of the larger O'Brien gang, would recurrently make headlines for liquor-fueled racial attacks around the West Side, usually against blacks and Italians, and it was known at the time that many of the black and Italian citizens of the Lower West Side were to avoid the Hell Gate area. Despite this, many black residents of the Lower West Side would make key clientele for the Irish mob's gambling racket, and the West Siders were known to run various gambling operations through the black communities. Additionally, some of the more isolated and disenfranchised Italians at the time in the Lower West Side were known to gamble with the Irish mob. In 1934, Frances McReary, who was now 23, would marry 21-year-old Nora O'Brien, a niece of Conor O'Brien, and this would solidify McReary's position within the O'Brien organization. Soon after this, in summer of 1935, Frances and Nora McReary would give birth to their first son, John McReary. During this time in the year 1935, the O'Brien gang would begin to feud with an up-and-coming gang of Italian youths out of the Lower West Side, known as the 3 Points Gang. The 3 Points Gang, led by 19-year-old Sicilian immigrant Mickey Pockets Della Russo, was a violent gang of young Italian thugs that served as a feeder team for the Pavano crime family. During the year 1935, Mickey Pockets and his gang would attempt to take control of the policy racket around the Lower West Side, a lottery system that the O'Brien gang had long controlled around the Lower West Side. Soon, as the 3 Points Gang would establish new lottery systems around the west side of Algonquin, members of the 3 Points Gang would take over the black clientele along Frankfort Avenue, formerly ran by the O'Brien gang. In the summer of 1935, several fights would take place in the street between the O'Brien gang and the 3 Points Gang, resulting in multiple deaths. In December of 1935, several members of the 3 Points Gang would storm an Irish bar on Hellgate late at night with firearms, and 11 key figures in the O'Brien gang would be taken out. Following this, the now 65-year-old Conor the Fox O'Brien would order his gang to actively search for members of the 3 Points Gang around Algonquin, and to open fire on sight. From 1936 to 1937, more than 500 separate shootings would be attributed to the war between the O'Brien gang and the 3 Points Gang, and it was rumored during this time that Frances McReary would become responsible for more than 100 shootings. During these years in the late 1930s, the Hellgate area, formerly called Little Ireland, would become known as Purgatory, for the bodies that were constantly turning up within the small 6-block neighborhood. In the year 1939, Frances McReary's 4-year-old son, John McReary, would be shot in crossfire while standing out on Hellgate. However, McReary would survive with only minor graze wounds. Also in the year 1939, legendary Irish mob leader Conor the Fox O'Brien would die of natural causes at age 69. With the death of Conor the Fox, the now 28-year-old Frances McReary would quickly become boosted to the top position within the Irish mob in Purgatory, and McReary would soon take the gang to new heights. During the early 1940s, as Frances McReary took control of the Irish mob in Algonquin, McReary and his men would develop a control over the quickly growing burlesque strip in Algonquin. The burlesque strip, which had been established during this time as the main entertainment corridor in Algonquin, would house several nightclubs, after-hours clubs, strip clubs, brothels, and gambling rooms, all of which would fall under the control of Frances McReary and the now expanding Irish mob. The McRearys would also control pornographic film theaters on Burlesque, as well as in other parts of the city. Additionally, by this point in the early to mid-1940s, the McRearys would become heavily involved in the drug business, as they would be involved in the trafficking of heroin, cocaine, marijuana, and other illegal narcotics. As successful as the Irish mob had become in these years, alcohol abuse would be a constant within the group. Frances McReary, like his father before him, had developed a major drinking problem as he got into his 30s, and McReary was known to drink whiskey daily. McReary's gang was much the same, a rough-and-tumble group of Irish thugs who liked to drink to the point of belligerency. Despite this, the McReary mob would run their operations with impunity and hold significant power in Algonquin. During these years, things would be relatively peaceful for the McReary crime organization. As their past wars with the 3 Points Gang had now subsided, McReary during these years would even develop positive dealings with Italian bosses from the Five Families, including Mario Messina and Carmen Lupacella, as Francis McReary spent most of his days holding court within the Irish mob, and most of his nights partying around Algonquin. McReary would leave much of his parenting responsibilities to his wife Nora, and as a result McReary's kids, John, Peter and Megan, would be raised largely by the wild streets of Purgatory. By 1945, Francis McReary's firstborn son John, who had survived a gunshot at age 4, would become a criminal at just 10 years old. The young John McReary, who was known for drinking, smoking, carrying weapons, and shaking down other kids around the neighborhood, was a beloved figure within the Irish mob, and would be treated like royalty by the Irish mobsters in Purgatory. By the late 1940s, Francis McReary had amassed millions of dollars, and he now had several serious earners in his outfit. The McReary crime syndicate in this era was headed by Francis McReary, alongside his longtime close friends, Patrick "Paddy the Horse" McAllister and James the Raper O'Toole, both of whom came up with McReary on Hellgate, and held tremendous power within the area. In the year 1950, Francis McReary's 15-year-old son John McReary would commit a murder while on a date with his then-girlfriend, Maureen O'Leary. This incident would transpire in a diner on Albany Avenue, when a 22-year-old Hispanic from the Governor Greg R. Smith housing projects, Tony Ramirez, would verbally berate Francis and Maureen while on a date. McReary would subsequently beat Ramirez into a bloody pulp before grabbing a knife and slashing Ramirez's face and body, and ultimately killing Ramirez in the diner. Soon, major police attention would be brought onto the matter, and as a result John McReary would be charged with murder at just 15. McReary, who was too young to be tried as an adult, would face just 2 years at a youth detention center in upstate Liberty before ultimately being released in 1952 at age 17. By the 1950s, Francis McReary's Irish mob had only grown stronger, and their Purgatory neighborhood was a known stronghold, feared by other criminal groups. The McRearys during this time maintained control over criminal rackets along Burlesque, and were continuing to make money from other illegal activities, including drug trafficking, loan sharking, bookmaking, robbery, and extortion. By 1955, the now 20-year-old John McReary had become a powerhouse in the Irish mob, making serious money as a bookmaker and loan shark, as well as carrying out acts of violence for his father's friends, and the young McReary was earning himself respect around Purgatory. In 1956, when John McReary's girlfriend Maureen O'Leary would become pregnant, McReary and O'Leary would get married at a ceremony at the Suffolk Church in the Lower West Side. Soon after, in July of 1956, John and Maureen would have their first son, Derek McReary. By 1957, the FIB was now keying in on the Irish mob, particularly the now 46-year-old Francis McReary and his right-hand man Paddy the Horse McAllister. By April of 1957, the FIB would flip several associates of McReary's gang, and the FIB would begin to secretly record McReary and McAllister during several business meetings. By 1958, the FIB would charge Francis McReary and Paddy McAllister with extortion, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit murder, and soon the leadership of the Irish mob in Purgatory would be thrown behind bars. By this point, Francis McReary's now 23-year-old son John McReary would take over many of the rackets left behind by his father, along with powerful Purgatory mobsters, 47-year-old Danny the Ox McSorley and 56-year-old Whistling Timmy McLeod. In 1960, high-ranking Purgatory mobster John McReary would move with his wife Maureen and his young son Derek into a spacious home on Savannah Avenue in Meadows Park, Dukes, a more quiet and laid-back area for the McRearys to raise their son. While John McReary would maintain control over the Irish mob's Algonquin presence, McReary would soon begin to spread the organization into the leafy borough of Dukes. Dukes, at this point in the year 1960, had a large concentration of Irish Americans, particularly in the Steinway neighborhood. Steinway, which was a working-class neighborhood in West Dukes, was home to the notorious Steinway Projects, which at the time was comprised almost entirely of lower-class Irish residents. Around the neighborhood, many Irish men would organize small gangs and burglary crews, making the Steinway area a key place of recruitment for the McReary family. In June of 1960, not long after John McReary had purchased his Meadows Park home, McReary would develop a rivalry with his first cousin, 31-year-old Brian McReary. Brian McReary, who led his own faction of the McReary crime family in Purgatory, was running his own rackets, and was refusing to pay tribute to McReary family higher-ups like Danny the Ox McSorley and Whistling Timmy McLeod. Additionally, Brian McReary and his gang were said to have robbed several of John McReary's drug shipments at the docks in Fishmarket South. Soon, John McReary would make a power move against his cousin. In June of 1960, John McReary would shoot and kill his cousin Brian McReary inside of a crowded jazz club in Star Junction. Following this, McReary would lead LCPD officers on a chase around the city, before hiding out at a safe house in the Bohan. Soon, when McReary would become wanted by the LCPD, McReary in June of 1960 would leave Liberty City and make a return to his family's homeland of Ireland. By 1961, after John McReary had spent several months in Ireland, Maureen McReary would plead with her husband to return to her and their 5-year-old son Derek in Liberty City. As McReary returned to Liberty City in October of 1961, he would settle at his home on Savannah Avenue in Dukes, and would aim to keep a low profile, as he was wanted in the city a year prior. However, after word would spread of McReary's return, John McReary would be arrested soon after in October of 1961 and charged with murder. Additionally, Maureen McReary would be charged in the matter with harboring a fugitive and would face serious fines. By the early 1960s, McReary family mobsters like Brian the Ox McSorley, Whistling Timmy McLeod, and Peter the Shark McReary had become highly powerful gangsters. While the five families generally looked down on the Irish mob and refused to do business with them, the McRearys by this point had several corrupt police officers on the take and had even developed connections at City Hall. Eventually, the McReary crime family would manage to have John McReary's sentence reduced, and McReary would be released from prison in December of 1962. Upon the release of the now 27-year-old John McReary, McReary would become the clear leader of the Irish mob in Liberty City, and would be hailed as the most respected Irish mobster in the city. By this point, McReary had crews in both Dukes and Algonquin, and was recruiting many of the young Irish gangsters around Steinway. While the borough of Dukes during this time was largely under the control of the Messina crime family, the McRearys at this time were able to maintain control of their Steinway territory, and had the respect of Messina family street crews. In October of 1963, John and Maureen McReary would have their second son, Francis McReary, who was named after his incarcerated grandfather. During these years in the 1960s, while John McReary had become boosted to one of the city's most powerful mobsters, McReary was developing issues within himself. McReary, who had a rough upbringing in the streets of Algonquin and who had been a heavy drinker since his youth, was severely dependent on alcohol and was known to drink whiskey and use drugs like marijuana and cocaine constantly. John McReary was also known to be both verbally and physically abusive to everyone around him. McReary, who was feared by everyone that knew him, was known to bully people, slap people, and make vicious remarks towards people. And of course, no one could ever stand up to John McReary. In his work, McReary was very sadistic, as he was known to take pleasure in the beating and torture of his victims. At home, McReary was violently abusive to his wife Maureen. However, Maureen would maintain her role as John McReary's faithful wife, living a life of servitude to her husband. McReary during these years was known to operate his day-to-day operations out of an Irish pub on Morris Street in Steinway, and during these years, the Steinway section of Dukes would become synonymous with John McReary and the Irish mob. During this time, the McReary mob would also develop ownership of a meat packing company in the meat quarter, and the gang would use the facility as a means to dispose of their victims. In November of 1964, a well-connected Irish politician from Purgatory, James McVicker, would be officially voted in as the mayor of Liberty City. McVicker, who was known to have ties to the five families, had also grown up around the McRearys, and had a younger brother, Mikey McVicker, who was a feared member of the McReary crime family. With the McRearys now closely connected with the city's new mayor, the McRearys by this point in the mid-60s were as powerful and well-connected as ever, and considered to be virtually untouchable in Liberty City. In 1965, the McReary family would develop a heated rivalry with the feared Messina crime family, led by then 70-year-old mob legend from Cerveza Heights, Don Mario Messina. This all began in May of 1965 when a McReary burglary crew successfully burglarized a high-stakes poker game in East Island City, coming away with $3 million. The poker game, which was interrupted by multiple armed robbers who would clear the room for its cash, was under the control of a Messina family street crew, headed by feared Dukes mobster Umberto Lino. Umberto Lino, a captain in the Messina crime family, led a massive street crew based in Cerveza Heights, Dukes, and Lino, by this point in the 1960s, was one of the most dangerous mobsters on the streets of Dukes. Soon, Umberto Lino would put multiple hits out on McReary family higher-ups. In June of 1965, McReary family heavyweight, Whistling Timmy McLeod, would be shot and killed outside of a bar on Frankfurt Avenue at age 63. Soon after, in July of 1965, the now 30-year-old John McReary and several of his men would get into a shootout with Messina family enforcers on Morris Street in Steinway, Dukes. This would result in 6 deaths and 11 injuries. Following this, with the havoc the Messina crime family had now caused for the McRearys, many within the McRearys would plan to retaliate with force against the Messinas. However, the reality at the time was, the Messina crime family had a stronghold, not only throughout Dukes, but within the entire city, and John McReary knew that if he and his gang were to take out a Messina family figure like for instance Umberto Lino or Mario Messina, he would be a dead man. Despite this, by the fall of 1965, John McReary and his brother Peter the Shark began to plot revenge against Umberto Lino. On an early morning in September of 1965, Peter the Shark McReary would plant a car bomb on the bottom of a black Albany Mañana parked outside of Umberto Lino's Cerveza Heights home. This car, however, did not belong to Umberto Lino, and would instead kill a 19-year-old civilian from Cerveza Heights named Jimmy DiTuro, when it exploded hours later. While this would never be tied directly to the McRearys, Liberty City Mayor and McReary associate James McVicker would soon reach out to John and Peter McReary, insisting they end their feud with the Messinas. By the end of 1965, the McReary family's conflict with the Messinas would subside. However, the rivalry would be far from over. By 1967, a Messina family captain who had long operated in and around Steinway, Sabino the Cigar Savello, and his crew would begin to shake down the McRearys in Dukes. In March of 1967, Sabino the Cigar Savello would send enforcers to a bookmaking office operated by the McRearys on Brandon Avenue in Steinway. During this altercation, the enforcers would demand that the McReary bookmakers pay 10% of their monthly earnings to Sabino the Cigar Savello and the Messina crime family. During this time, the Messina family had a widely known reputation in Dukes for being extremely ruthless and violent. And following this visit, many of John McReary's Steinway bookmakers would elect to pay the Messinas in fear of their wrath. However, John McReary would have different ideas. John McReary, who had no fear of any mafia families in Liberty City, would in April of 1967 tell the aging Sabino Savello to go fuck himself when the two would meet in Steinway. And while Savello's crew was outraged, the Messinas would never take action. By May of 1967, the Messina family was now at an intense war with the Ancelotti family. And with the Messina bosses on the lam, the McRearys would be able to maintain their prominence in the streets of Dukes. During this time, the Purgatory neighborhood in Algonquin was still under the rule of the McReary family, with John McReary's brother Peter the Shark McReary overseeing the area. Additionally, the McRearys at the time were maintaining their control of several underground rackets on Burlesque, as well as operating sex shops and prostitution rings around Algonquin. Around the year 1969, John McReary would develop a friendship with a powerful captain in the Lupacella crime family, 39-year-old Joseph Joey the Shiv Gallardo. Gallardo, a highly powerful mobster based out of the Bohan, was by 1969 one of the main rising stars in the Liberty City underworld, and soon Joey the Shiv would recruit the McRearys to perform hits on his behalf, and in return Gallardo would watch John McReary's back. By 1970, the now 35-year-old John McReary, despite being the boss of the powerful Irish mob in Liberty City, was descending into a miserable drunken mess. McReary, who was constantly under the influence of drugs and alcohol, was known to be somewhat depressed and pessimistic during these years, as well as extremely vicious towards those around him. McReary during these years had also become concerned with what would be known as the Troubles, an ethno-nationalist conflict that would begin to wage in the McReary family's homeland of Ireland during this time. McReary's oldest son, the now 14-year-old Derek McReary, during this time would also become deeply concerned with the Troubles. and along with other Irish-American men around Dukes would organize various protests and demonstrations to speak out against the Protestant Unionist population in Ireland, who desired to remain part of the United Kingdom, as Derek McReary, his father, and many like them were Catholics that believed strongly in the nationalist perspective of joining a unified Republic of Ireland. Subsequently, in July of 1970, Derek McReary would be arrested in Dukes for disorderly conduct in connection with a protest gone wrong. McReary's younger son, the now 7-year-old Francis McReary, would at this time take up a job as an altar boy at a nearby church in Meadows Park, where he would soon begin to pocket money from the donation plate. By 1973, John and Maureen McReary would have their third son, Gerald McReary. At this point in the early 1970s, as John and Maureen McReary would raise their 3 young sons in Meadows Park, John McReary would still be somewhat attentive as a father at times, despite his issues with drugs and mental illness. And though the McRearys were a dysfunctional family that often fought with each other, they would nonetheless remain a tight-knit and loyal family. By June of 1974, Derek McReary, who was now working to aid Irish nationalist forces in their fight against the United Kingdom, would once again be arrested in connection with a protest gone wrong, just before his 18th birthday. By 1975, John McReary was drinking more than ever and using drugs constantly. McReary by this point was drinking up to 3 bottles of whiskey per day and smoking up to an ounce of marijuana per day, and as a result of this, McReary was quickly losing his mind and engaging in odd behavior. In 1976, a drunken John McReary would rape a woman named Michelle Kelly, the wife of McReary family soldier Greg Kelly. Following this, when Greg Kelly would learn of this incident, Kelly would brutally beat John McReary inside of his Irish pub on Morris Street. McReary, who was beaten to a bloody pulp by Kelly, would suffer major brain trauma and would be hospitalized for a week. Not long after, McReary would have Greg Kelly kidnapped and killed. McReary, who had a long history of sexual deviancy, was now descending into a place of darkness. By the late 70s, McReary would begin frequenting several brothels and prostitution dens around Liberty City and engaging in perverted sexual acts. It was around this time, unbeknownst to his crime family, John McReary would become involved in homosexual acts at several gay clubs around the city. McReary knew that if his soldiers were to become aware of this, he would immediately be stripped of his position and likely killed. However, McReary would often visit these gay clubs while in the midst of a liquor and drug-fueled bender, and would never be exposed for this secret. As this was happening, the McReary crime organization was beginning to show signs of suffering. In Algonquin, many members of the McReary family were now alcoholics and drug addicts, and despite controlling various illegal rackets, the McRearys in Algonquin were increasingly being muscled by the 5 families, and generally not recruiting any new members. Their Purgatory neighborhood, which was once dominated by Irish Americans, was now 24% Hispanic and 15% African American, and with poverty and drug addiction plaguing the area, Purgatory by this point was considered a ghetto. Additionally, in 1977, beloved Liberty City Mayor James McVicker would be succeeded by an up-and-coming politician from Algonquin, Michael Barbosa, and thus the McReary family would lose much of their stronghold within the city's political hierarchy. In Dukes, however, the McRearys had built a large network of Irish-American gangsters from multiple different age groups, and were able to make substantial earnings from illegal activities like drug trafficking, arms trafficking, murder for hire, robbery, and bookmaking. At this point, John McReary's oldest son, Derek McReary, would develop a strained relationship with his drunken father and would move into his own home in Steinway, Dukes. Derek McReary during this time was continuing to aid his fellow Irishmen overseas in their fight against the United Kingdom, as he and his friends would commit several robberies around the city to help send money and weapons to Ireland. McReary, who was a gangster like his father and grandfather before him, had a unique sense of devotion when it came to helping his Irish people fight the United Kingdom and form the Republic of Ireland, and the young McReary would selflessly dedicate his time and energy to this fight. Then in 1978, the now 22-year-old Derek McReary, along with his close friend, another Irish criminal from Steinway, 21-year-old Bucky Sligo, would be arrested during the botched robbery of a currency exchange in Meadow Hills, Dukes. McReary and Sligo, who both had criminal records in connection with several unruly protests, would be sentenced to 5 years each for armed robbery, while the acts of John McReary and the young Derek McReary would drive the family's devout Catholic matriarch Maureen McReary into constant worry. John and Maureen's second son, Francis, would seemingly be the diamond in the rough of the family. By 1979, the now 16-year-old Francis McReary was excelling in school, working closely with the local church in Meadows Park. And despite his habit of stealing money from the donation plate, Francis was on path to eventually become a priest. Also in 1979, John and Maureen McReary, who were both 44 years old at the time, would have their fourth son, Patrick McReary. In 1980, the McRearys would have a major problem when the now 45-year-old boss of the Irish mob in Liberty City, John McReary, would develop a rivalry with his brother, 44-year-old Peter the Shark McReary, who he felt was shorting money from him and attempting to call his own shots in purgatory. Soon, in April of 1980, John McReary would arrange for Peter the Shark McReary to be shot 4 times while exiting his vehicle on Galveston Avenue in purgatory. Peter the Shark would, however, survive despite being paralyzed in the attack, and would soon begin plotting against John McReary. Peter the Shark McReary, who had several loyalists in and around purgatory, as well as close connections with several African-American street gangs in the city, would put a contract of $10 million on John McReary's head. Weeks later, John McReary, who had been laying low in the Bohan, would arrange for a second attempt to be made on the life of his brother. In May of 1980, the now wheelchair-bound Peter the Shark McReary would be hailed with gunfire outside of an Irish pub in purgatory. However, once again, Peter McReary would survive an assassination attempt. By this point in 1980, the Purgatory neighborhood, which was one of the most impoverished, violent, and drug-addled areas in all of Lower Algonquin, was now divided between 2 opposing factions of the McReary crime organization, and as a result multiple shootouts would take place in and around Purgatory in May of 1980. In June of 1980, John McReary would be shot multiple times at a newsstand in Cerveza Heights with close friend Joe the Hambone Murphy, and while Murphy was killed, McReary would survive after being rushed to the nearby Cerveza Heights Medical Center. Not long after, in what would perhaps save both of the McReary brothers from being killed, Peter the Shark McReary and several of his associates would be arrested in the raid of a warehouse in Fishmarket South for heroin trafficking. As this happened, John McReary and his men would rub out several of the remaining Peter McReary loyalists in Purgatory and Steinway, and John McReary would once again assert himself as the Irish mob chieftain of Liberty City. Also around this time, in July of 1980, John and Maureen McReary would have their 5th and final child, Kate McReary. Upon the birth of John McReary's first daughter, McReary, despite being a deeply depraved individual, would be a genuinely loving father towards Kate McReary, and would have a newfound dedication to the protection and care of his daughter. By August of 1980, Derek McReary, who had been incarcerated for armed robbery since 1978, would be released on parole alongside Bucky Sligo. McReary and Sligo, who had become skilled thieves in the late 70s, would soon go back to their old ways and begin carrying out high-stakes robberies around Liberty City. Also in the year 1980, the McReary family's original founder, 69-year-old Francis McReary, who had been in prison since 1958 and who had since committed several murders in prison, would die in prison from his alcoholism. During the early 1980s, many wealthy businessmen began buying cheap properties in the rough Purgatory neighborhood. Soon, as the lower west side of Algonquin around Purgatory would become prime real estate, a major gentrification of the Purgatory neighborhood was beginning to take place. By this point, with Peter the Shark McReary gone, John McReary less involved with the rackets, and the main base of the McReary organization now based around Dukes, the McReary family's presence in Purgatory was starting to die out. By this point, the McRearys still had bookmaking offices and drug spots around Purgatory, as well as a bar they had long frequented on the corner of Hellgate and Galveston Avenue. However, by 1983, rent in Purgatory was skyrocketing, and apartments in the neighborhood were now filling up with spoiled trust fund yuppies, art students, and sycophantic hipsters. In June of 1983, the now 20-year-old Francis McReary, who had long planned to be a priest at the church in Meadows Park, was rejected by the church when he was caught cheating on his final exam. Following this, with the young Francis McReary now unable to become a priest, McReary would attend a police academy in Algonquin and would set his sights on becoming an LCPD officer. Also around this time in 1983, the troubled John McReary would descend into a darker place than ever before. At some point in the year 1983, John McReary would begin to sexually touch his son Gerald McReary while on his drunken benders. Gerald McReary would be forever traumatized by these experiences and would never mention these experiences to a soul. By 1985, the now 22-year-old Francis McReary would complete his training and would be officially sworn in as an LCPD officer, while John McReary, whose mind was polluted from drugs and alcohol, would believe that Francis McReary would help aid his crime syndicate as a police officer. Francis McReary insisted on distancing himself from his father and what was left of the McReary crime family. While Francis McReary appeared to be taking the clean route, unlike his father and grandfather before him, Gerald McReary would soon prove to be of the old McReary cloth. By 1985, at just 12, Gerald McReary was involved in crime with many of his friends around the Meadows Park neighborhood, and Gerald would eventually become associated with a notorious street gang known as the Park Boys. Gerald McReary during these years would do anything to avoid his father, and would spend most of his time on the streets of Dukes. Soon in the mid-1980s, Gerald McReary would become involved with drugs, both using and selling them, as well as extortion, robbery, and bookmaking. Despite his young age, Gerald McReary was known to be extremely tough with his hands, and was one of the most feared kids in all of Dukes in the mid-80s. In September of 1985, the now 29-year-old Derek McReary would be pulled over on Dukes Boulevard in Cerveza Heights. Upon a search of McReary's vehicle, LCPD officers would discover several high-powered explosives that McReary was believed to have been planning to send to Ireland. Following this, McReary, who now had an extensive criminal background, would be sentenced to 5 years in prison. By 1986, the now 13-year-old Gerald McReary, who was known to friends as Jerry, would become a serious criminal, and would eventually become connected with his brother's friend out of Steinway, Bucky Sligo. Sligo, who was a skilled and experienced thief, would soon teach the young Jerry McReary how to pull off major robberies. In August of 1986, Jerry and Bucky would be arrested for grand larceny after the two of them would rob a jewelry store in Algonquin. Following this, while Bucky would be reacquainted with his good pal Derek in prison, Jerry McReary would be briefly sent to a youth detention center in upstate Liberty. By 1987, Derek McReary, who had been in prison since 1985, would become addicted to heroin that was secretly being sold to him through prison guards. And this addiction would stick with McReary for years to come, with Derek McReary spending most of his prison sentence laced out in his cell as opposed to fighting on the yard with other inmates. McReary would be released on good behavior in March of 1989 after spending 4 years locked up. McReary, who had grown tired of being put through the prison system in Liberty City and being distracted from his goal of fighting for Ireland, would plan with his close friends Bucky Sligo and Aidan O'Malley to leave for Ireland and fight for the Provisional IRA, an Irish nationalist paramilitary group that was fighting against the United Kingdom. By June of 1989, Derek McReary, Bucky Sligo, and Aidan O'Malley would all travel to Ireland and start fighting with the Provisional IRA to defeat the United Kingdom. By the year 1990, the McReary crime organization was a shell of its former self. By this point, the McRearys had completely lost their territory in Algonquin and were now a small group of Irish gangsters operating out of Steinway. The now 55-year-old John McReary by this point had lost the respect of all other crime bosses around the city due to his drunken manner. However, McReary was able to maintain control over his gang through fear, killing anyone who defied him at the drop of a hat. By 1990, the now 17-year-old Jerry McReary would move into his own apartment in Steinway, and was now leading a tough gang of young Irish gangsters in the neighborhood. With Jerry now out of the house, it was around this time the sick and depraved John McReary would now be abusing his son Patrick McReary. Like he had done to Jerry before him, Patrick McReary would be deeply traumatized in these experiences for many years to come. In August of 1990, Jerry McReary was arrested and charged with assault for brutally beating a man from Steinway named Greg Markopoulos, who owed McReary $3,000. McReary would get probation for this beating. By 1991, Jerry McReary would recruit his 12-year-old brother Patrick McReary, who everyone called Packy, to commit several crimes for Jerry's gang. By the time Packy was 13, his older brother Jerry would use him as a spotter to oversee drug deals around Dukes. soon, like his brother Packy McReary, would become heavily involved in the streets of Liberty City and all the drugs and violence that comes along with it. In late 1992, Jerry McReary would be arrested with his close friends John O'Leary and Danny Doyle for the armed hijacking of a cargo truck near Francis International Airport. Following this, McReary, O'Leary, and Doyle would each be sentenced to 5 years in prison. In April of 1993, 58-year-old boss of the Irish mob in Liberty City, the sick and demented John McReary, would finally take his own life, shooting himself in the head in his backyard in Meadows Park. Though McReary would be mourned by the Irish community in Dukes, none of whom could have imagined the extent of John McReary's depravity, Liberty City would forever be a better place without John McReary. Since John McReary took over the Irish mob in the early 60s, McReary had taken the organization from a thriving staple of the city to an almost non-existent group of washed-up thugs and two-bit punks. With John McReary gone, many of the old Irish mobsters from his gang would essentially retire. However, a few of John McReary's men, namely Sailor Sam Callahan and Scott Burke, would remain highly active gangsters in Steinway. However, the remaining Irish crews in Steinway would soon be heavily extorted by rising Messina crime family boss Harvey Noto, who had recently taken over Dukes. In 1993, while Jerry McReary was in prison for hijacking, McReary would befriend the incarcerated don of the Lupacella crime family, Vincent Lupacella, who was serving time for racketeering. Vincent Lupacella, who killed his own twin brother back in his early 20s in a power struggle to take over the Lupacella crime family, was a feared mob boss deeply entrenched in the fabric of Liberty City. Though Vincent Lupacella was a mean man who didn't make friends with many people, Lupacella saw a certain attribute in the young Jerry McReary that reminded him of himself, and while in prison together, the two would form a mutual respect. By 1994, Derek McReary, who was in Ireland fighting with the Provisional IRA with Bucky Sligo and Aidan O'Malley, would begin to make multiple trips back to Liberty City to commit robberies, partially to fund his war effort in Ireland, and partially to fund his heroin addiction. During this time, Derek McReary would routinely travel back to Liberty City, usually with Bucky and Aidan, and the three would commit various heists around Liberty City. This included the robbing of a small bank in the Bohan, the robbery of several jewelry stores, and Derek and his crew even managed to rip off the Ancelotti crime family multiple times. Then, in August of 1995, when Derek McReary, Bucky Sligo, and Aidan O'Malley would all fly into Francis International Airport from Ireland together, the three of them would be swarmed by FIB agents inside the airport and taken down for a string of robberies around Liberty City. Soon as the FIB began to squeeze the weakened and heroin-addicted Derek McReary, McReary would agree to flip and testify against his friends. By the end of 1995, Derek McReary's testimony would lead to the arrest of many major IRA figures, including Aidan O'Malley, who was sentenced to 20 years in prison, and soon the FIB would allow McReary to return to Ireland. Jerry McReary, who was released from prison at age 23 after serving 4 years, was a tough and hardened young man. Between the abuse and beatings of his father, the hostile nature of the family he was raised in, and his violent and crime-filled upbringing, McReary by his early 20s was a rough and aggressive man, known to bully and abuse people. Similarly to his father, Jerry would verbally berate people in a way that made people fear him, and Jerry, who was a tall and imposing man, was equally as tough with his fists. Additionally, Jerry was known to drink and use cocaine, which only fueled his intense personality. As Jerry would return to the streets in 1996, McReary would quickly regain a leadership role over what was left of the Irish mob in Dukes. McReary, who was highly respected and feared, particularly within his young generation in Dukes, would soon use his connections to Vincent Lupacella to carry out hits and other criminal acts for the Lupacella crime family. Around this time, Jerry would be introduced to Vincent Lupacella's son, Mark Lupacella, who most people called Loopy because of his wild personality and lack of common sense. As the now 23-year-old Jerry McReary re-established himself in Dukes, Jerry would move back into his mother's home on Savannah Avenue in Dukes alongside his 17-year-old brother Packy and his 16-year-old sister Kate, and Jerry would maintain a close relationship with his mother Maureen McReary, who was now 61 years old, and a depressed widow since the death of her husband John McReary. Jerry McReary, at this time in 1996, who had gotten divorced with his first wife while he was serving time in prison, would marry a second wife, 23-year-old Laura McNeil, an Irish girl from Steinway. As the McRearys would learn of Derek McReary's cooperation with the FIB, Jerry and Packy would renounce their brother, who was now a rat scumbag in their eyes. By 1997, Jerry and Packy McReary would hit the streets and reorganize a solid group of tough young Irish gangsters, reforming what was left of the McReary crime family. While many of the major earners in Steinway would be shaken down and forced to pay street tax to the Messina crime family, who was extremely powerful at that time in the area, Jerry and Packy were now making some considerable money selling drugs, robbing dealers, stealing cars, extorting business owners, and carrying out hits for the Lupacella family. In July of 1997, the now 18-year-old Packy McReary would be arrested and charged with grand theft auto when he was caught stealing a benefactor in East Island City. McReary would be held at the Cerveza Heights precinct for a few days where he was beaten by officers, before being released back to the streets. Packy McReary, who by this point was notorious around Meadows Park and Steinway, was another tough and dangerous McReary brother, despite his charismatic and fun-loving personality. However, Packy would be faced with many internal struggles of his own. Packy, who like his older brother Jerry was beaten and sickly abused by his father, and who was forced to drop out from school at an early age to stay home and roll joints for his father, was a rough kid from the streets, and would see no other way in life than the criminal route. Despite this, Packy, who was a habitual user of cocaine and marijuana, was known to be a fun-loving partygoer, who would frequent many of the hot nightlife areas in Liberty City. By 1998, Packy would be charged with grand larceny for stealing a diamond worth $500,000 in Algonquin. However, charges would eventually be dropped, as the diamond would never be found. Over the years in Steinway, the McRearys had long recruited from an Irish street gang known as the Morris Street Boys. As the former Morris Street Boys, men like John O'Leary and Danny Doyle would eventually graduate to working with Jerry McReary in the McReary crime family. By 1999, an apprentice of Jerry McReary and a good friend of Packy, 22-year-old Nate McKinnon from Steinway would become the leader of a newly formed street gang, changing their name from the Morris Street Boys to the more intimidating title of the Irish Killers. As this happened, Nate McKinnon and the Irish Killers, who would go on to terrorize the Steinway area, would also work loyally for Jerry McReary and the McReary crime family. By this point in 1999, the Steinway area had become one of the most violent areas in all of Dukes. This was not so much a result of the Irish gangsters in Steinway, but rather a result of gang violence that was now taking place in and around the Steinway projects, which were now dominated by African Americans. Despite this, the Irishmen in Steinway were not to be crossed, and would maintain the control of neighborhood operations. By May of 1999, the now 26-year-old boss of the McReary crime family, Jerry McReary, would be arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit extortion, after his close friend and enforcer Tobias Petropoulos would wear a wire on him while he would give Petropoulos orders to shake down a Steinway bar owner. As a result, Jerry McReary would once again be sent away to prison, this time on a 7-year sentence. Around this time, in 1999, when it was revealed that members of the Irish Killer Street Gang had robbed and beaten a businessman back in 1998 that was affiliated with the Lupacella crime family, Mark Lupacella would officially end any involvement his family had with the McRearys. Also in 1999, the now 36-year-old Francis McReary, who had been a well-liked and respected police officer since 1985, would be promoted to a sergeant within the LCPD. By this point, Francis would have little to no contact with his brothers. In the year 2000, the now 21-year-old Packy McReary, who was at the time running the McReary crime family for his incarcerated brother Jerry, would be arrested alongside 2 members of the Irish Killers in the Bohan for hijacking a cargo truck full of plasma screen televisions. Following this, Packy would be sent to prison for 2 years, where he would be reacquainted with his brother Jerry. By 2002, Jerry and Packy McReary would both be back on the street and would continue to build the Irish mob. In February of 2002, members of the McReary crime family would meet members of the Spanish Lord Street Gang in an alley in East Island City in order to sell them a kilo of cocaine. However, during this deal, the McReary family soldiers would be ambushed by Spanish lords, and the Spanish lords would manage to escape with the kilo. Following this, Jerry McReary would make a major statement. In February of 2002, Jerry and Packy McReary would kidnap someone named Hector Colon, a high-ranking member of the Spanish lords in Cerveza Heights, after the McReary brothers would bring Colon to a garage in Steinway. Jerry McReary would brutally interrogate Colon before ultimately beheading him, and sending his separate head to an apartment in Cerveza Heights owned by the Spanish lords. This would send shockwaves throughout the Spanish lord street gang in Cerveza Heights, and would exemplify the ruthless nature of the now 29-year-old Jerry McReary. At this point in the early 2000s, both Jerry and Packy McReary, along with most of their soldiers in the Irish mob, would be major cocaine users, as well as drunks. However, the two of them would hold significant power in the streets. The McReary brothers by this point had also developed deep connections in the streets. By 2003, Jerry had developed ties with the Ancelotti crime family, a powerful Liberty City mafia family that had territory in both Algonquin and Alderney. Soon, Jerry and Packy would take jobs from the Ancelotti family, particularly a street crew based in Algonquin ran by Tony Black Spoleto and his brother Michael. Additionally, by 2003, Jerry and Packy McReary would develop ties to Bohan-based drug kingpin Elizabetta Torres, and soon the McRearys would go on to do work for Torres, as well as for several African-American street gangs that Torres would connect them with. During this time, Derek McReary, who was once a dedicated and inspired freedom fighter, was now a heroin-addicted snitch hiding out in a remote part of Ireland. Eventually, by 2003, Derek would begin working in Ireland for a notorious North Korean crime boss named Park Young-gook, buying his counterfeit banknotes in order to exchange them to the current rate. By 2005, Jerry would develop ties to an up-and-coming captain in the Alderney-based Pecorino crime family, 29-year-old Ray Bocchino. Bocchino, who grew up in the West Dyke neighborhood in North Alderney near Sacramento Avenue and Purcell Road, in an area entrenched by the mafia, was by 2004 a rising star in the Alderney mob, now operating in areas of Liberty City. Soon, Ray Bocchino, who had done time alongside Jerry in Liberty State Correctional Facility, would eventually recruit Jerry McReary, as well as his brother Packy, to complete various jobs on his behalf. In June of 2005, Jerry McReary would be arrested in upstate Liberty for the fixing of a dog race. While McReary would only be sentenced to probation in this incident, Jerry McReary following this arrest would go on to take a more hands-off approach to his crimes, leaving most of his dirty work to his brother Packy and other McReary associates. Also in the summer of 2005, the now 26-year-old Packy McReary would be arrested in Algonquin for possession of cocaine in the presence of a known prostitute. By 2006, the McReary crime family was a small yet dangerous crew, now working more closely with Ray Bocchino and the Pecorino crime family of Alderney. By 2007, as the McRearys became affiliated with Ray Bocchino, the McRearys' relationship with the Ancelotti family would fade, and soon Ray Bocchino would use the McRearys to weaken the Ancelottis, who now were developing a rivalry with the Pecorino family. By 2008, the now 29-year-old Packy McReary had put together a solid robbery crew with his close friends, 28-year-old Michael Keane and 29-year-old Gordon Sargent, both members of the Irish mob. Around this point, Packy and his crew would begin routinely ripping off other criminal gangs around the city, including the Liberty City Triads, a Chinese gang that had territory in both Dukes and Algonquin, as well as the Ancelotti crime family, who Jerry and Packy now hated. It was around this time Jerry and Packy would begin to plot a major heist of the Bank of Liberty headquarters in downtown Algonquin. Also around this time, after hiding out in Ireland for 13 years, the now 52-year-old Derek McReary would return to Liberty City. Derek, who was down and out, hopelessly addicted to heroin and liquor, and short on money, would soon be welcomed back into his family home in Meadows Park, and his brothers, after 13 years, would overlook the fact that their oldest brother was now a rat. Soon, as Jerry and Packy's older brother Derek would return to the fold in need of cash, Jerry and Packy would recruit their brother, who was a skilled and experienced thief, to help them in their plot to rob the Bank of Liberty. Derek McReary, who had pulled off numerous heists in his life, would be the perfect man for the job, and would soon get hold of the explosives that he had used in the past during his war effort in Ireland. Derek McReary was a complicated person. Although he had cooperated with the FIB back in the 90s, something that his brothers resented him for, the McRearys would always admire their eldest brother for his dedication to Ireland, and pity him for his complex past. Soon, the McRearys, who had a long history of thievery in Liberty City, would put their plan into action. In June of 2008, Packy McReary, Derek McReary, Michael Keane, and another unknown McReary associate would drive to the Bank of Liberty in downtown Algonquin. Upon their entry, the masked McReary robbers would hold the bank, patrons and staff, at gunpoint, and Derek McReary would attempt to rig the bank's vault with explosives. At some point during the heist, a bank patron from Hatton Gardens, Eugene Reaper, would pull out his firearm, shooting and killing McReary gangster Michael Keane, and Reaper would be killed seconds later. Despite this misfortune, the McReary robbers would proceed to open the vault with explosives and collect a large sum of cash, totaling just over $1 million. Upon the exit of the robbers would be met with an LCPD ambush, and a large shootout and chase would ensue around Algonquin, before the robbers would lose the cops in a stolen car and make their way back to Duke's with the cash. Upon this, the McRearys would divide up the cash from the heist, and the heist, which would be known as the Bank of Liberty heist, would be the most lucrative heist of its kind pulled off in Liberty City during the 21st century to date. Not long after this, Derek McReary would become concerned with his old pal, the now 51-year-old Bucky Sligo. Sligo, who was jammed up by the FIB back in the 90s as a result of Derek's cooperation, was now running a small criminal operation in North Alderney, and the word on the street was that Sligo and his gang were going to kill Derek. Soon, Derek would have a McReary hitman take out Sligo and several members of his crew at their hangout in North Alderney. It was around this time the now 45-year-old Francis McReary would become concerned with his brother Derek's presence in Liberty City. Francis McReary, who had been a sergeant at the LCPD's Suffolk precinct since 1999, was by 2008 in the running to become police commissioner, and was now hearing rumors that his brother Derek would be meeting with reporters to discuss various aspects of his life. Francis, who had an intense rivalry with his older brother Derek since their childhood, viewed Derek as an embarrassment, and piled with his other two brothers being involved in crime, Francis felt Derek's presence would ruin his chances of becoming commissioner. Soon, in July of 2008, Francis McReary would act on his concern over his older brother, hiring a hitman to assassinate Derek when they would meet at Castle Gardens Park in Lower Algonquin. Following the death of Derek McReary, a funeral would be held at the Suffolk Church, organized by McReary's family. During Derek McReary's funeral in downtown Algonquin, Albanian mobsters would open fire on the procession, and a major shootout would take place in front of the church. This attack was carried out in retaliation to a long-time feud growing between the Albanian mob and the McReary crime family, who had been attempting to weaken the Albanians' connection to the Ancelotti crime family. As all this was happening, the FIB was now closely keying in on Jerry McReary, who they had been building a case against all year. The following week, Jerry McReary, the boss of the Irish mob in Liberty City, would be taken down by the FIB in a racketeering conspiracy and held at the Alderney State Prison in Actor. With Jerry off the street, he would continue to run the McReary crime family from prison through visitors, though the group by this point was now lacking organizational structure. Despite the McRearys recently having pulled off the Bank of Liberty heist, the McRearys were sinking money into Jerry McReary's legal defense and struggling to earn from their traditional street rackets. Because of this, the McRearys had become weakened and especially desperate to generate funds. Soon into Jerry's imprisonment, Jerry and his brother Packy would devise yet another risky scheme to make money. The McRearys, who had a long-time disdain for the Ancelotti crime family, particularly their leader, the notorious Giovanni the Old Man Ancelotti, would plan to kidnap Ancelotti's 31-year-old daughter Grace and hold her for ransom. While this plan was highly dangerous, the Ancelottis at this time were known to be somewhat vulnerable, and the McRearys believed they would be able to pull one over on them. Soon, the McRearys would send one of their goons to Grace Ancelotti's home in Actor, Alderney, where she would be kidnapped and brought to an apartment building in Leftwood, Alderney. Following this, the McRearys would send antagonistic messages to Giovanni Ancelotti and his men, including pictures of his daughter in bondage, and the McRearys would make it clear that they wanted $2 million in exchange for his daughter's life. After the McRearys would successfully hold Grace Ancelotti in Alderney for more than a week, Giovanni Ancelotti would finally reach an agreement with the McRearys, agreeing to give the McRearys precious diamonds he had obtained from one of his debtors. Soon, Ancelotti would send representatives close to Grace to meet Packy McReary on Charge Island and make the exchange. However, as this was happening, Russian mobsters would ambush Packy McReary along with one of his enforcers, and while McReary would be able to shoot his way out of the situation, the diamonds would be lost in the process. Following the loss of the diamonds, the McRearys would be outraged, as all of their efforts in kidnapping Grace Ancelotti would be unrewarded. By this point, Jerry McReary was being hit with multiple felony counts, and it was becoming clear that Jerry, who had been in and out of prison his whole life, wouldn't be getting released anytime soon. A month later, more tragedy would strike for the McReary family, when the youngest child of John and Maureen McReary, 28-year-old Kate McReary, would be shot and killed at the Suffolk church, attending the wedding of broker couple, Roman and Mallory Bellick. Following the untimely murder of Kate McReary, maybe the only innocent member of the family, the McReary family would be deeply devastated. By this point in 2008, the now 73-year-old Maureen McReary had lost her husband John, her firstborn son Derek, and her only daughter Kate, and by this point was deeply depressed. Packy by this point was being hunted by the Ancelotti crime family for the kidnapping of Grace Ancelotti, and was considered to be a dead man. Soon, in January of 2009, Packy McReary, who knew his days in the city were numbered, would move to Los Santos, abandoning his life in Liberty City. By 2009, with Jerry McReary in prison and Packy McReary in Los Santos, the McReary crime family would be officially defunct, ending what would be roughly a century of Irish organized crime in Liberty City. While various other gangs have since taken control of the Steinway area, a small number of Irish gangsters are still rumored to be active around Dukes.